In
For
the early 9th
Valhalla!
century, England was not the
Charge!
unified nation we recognize today. Instead, it was a mosaic of small kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, each ruled by its own king, each with its own ambitions and rivalries. The landscape was dotted with fortified towns, sprawling farmland, and isolated monasteries that served as both spiritual and economic centers. Life for the average Anglo-Saxon was a careful balance of work, faith, and survival, yet for all its seeming stability, the kingdom existed on a knife's edge, unaware of the storm quietly brewing across the North Sea. Monasteries like Lindisfarne and Jarrow were jewels of learning and art. Monks spent their days meticulously copying manuscripts, chronicling history, and preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to time. But beyond their tranquil walls, the rhythm of life was harsh. Farmers labored from dawn to dusk, tending crops and livestock to feed families and fulfill taxes owed to local lords. Villages were tight-knit communities where everyone knew one another, and bonds of loyalty and obligation shaped everyday existence. These settlements were peaceful, yet vulnerable, unprepared for the kind of devastation that would soon arrive on longships with dragon-headed prows slicing through the fog. Trade flourished along rivers and coastal ports. England exported wool, grain, and salt, while importing silver, luxury goods, and rare spices. This wealth, however, was also a beacon, drawing the attention of the seafaring Norsemen, Vikings whose reputation for ferocity had already begun to echo along the coasts of Europe. The Vikings were more than just raiders, they were master sailors, skilled navigators, and opportunistic warriors. Their longships could traverse both open sea and shallow rivers, allowing them to strike where and when least expected. For the Anglo-Saxons, the Norse were a distant rumor at first, almost mythic, tales of ruthless warriors who could appear overnight and vanish just as quickly. Despite occasional skirmishes with neighboring kingdoms, most Anglo-Saxon lords assumed their walls, shields, and swords were sufficient to protect their people. The sense of normalcy was comforting, but it was also fragile. Coastal villages, unfortified monasteries, and small towns presented easy targets, and the Anglo-Saxons had no experience dealing with invaders who struck with lightning speed, exploited intelligence, and showed little mercy. As historians later noted, it was a world perfectly poised for upheaval, a society that had never faced a threat on the scale about to arrive. Amid this relative calm, the stage was quietly being set. Across the North Sea, Scandinavian societies were experiencing pressures of their own. Harsh winters, population growth, and limited farmland made raiding a lucrative and often necessary venture. Ambitious Viking leaders, hungry for wealth, fame, and glory, began to plan expeditions, eyeing England's rich monasteries and fertile lands. The contrast between these two worlds, peaceful Anglo-Saxon England and the restless, battle-hardened Norsemen, would define the drama of the coming years. By the end of this section, the audience is left with a profound sense of anticipation. They understand the stakes. England's prosperity and fragile political balance make it vulnerable, while the Vikings' ambition and skill promise chaos. Emotional tension builds naturally through contrasts, the serenity of monasteries versus the violence hinted at across the sea, the everyday lives of villagers against the looming shadow of destruction. The calm before the storm is more than a temporal setting, it's a psychological landscape, where fear, ignorance, and destiny converge, preparing viewers for the first violent clash that would forever alter the course of English history. The tranquility of Anglo-Saxon England was shattered as the first Norse longships appeared on the horizon. These sleek vessels, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the morning mist, were unlike anything the locals had seen. Small at first, just a handful of ships, the initial raid seemed almost like a strange rumor come to life. Yet the devastation left in their wake quickly proved the legends were terrifyingly real. Coastal villages, unprepared for sudden violence, were the first to feel the sting of Viking ambition. One of the earliest and most infamous targets was the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. Monks who had spent decades copying sacred texts and tending to their cloisters found themselves facing invaders with swords, axes, and fire. The Vikings moved with terrifying efficiency, looting treasures, slaughtering those who resisted, and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Chroniclers of the time described the scene as a grim portent, marking not just a raid but the beginning of a new era of fear. Emotionally, this moment hits the audience hard, the serene sanctity of faith and learning violently interrupted, showing the human cost of ambition and greed. Beyond Lindisfarne, the raids spread along the eastern coasts. The Vikings were tactical and adaptive, exploiting rivers and inlets to strike inland, hitting towns and trade hubs that believed themselves safe. These attacks revealed a shocking contrast between the defensive strategies of the Anglo-Saxons, slow to mobilize, rigid, and reliant on static fortifications, and the mobility, speed, and cunning of the Norse warriors. Villagers who thought they were protected by walls and natural barriers quickly realized that their sense of security was an illusion. Fear spread faster than the raiders themselves, and word of these attacks ignited panic across kingdoms. The raiders themselves were not just mindless destroyers. They were skilled navigators, able to read the winds and tides, and seasoned warriors who coordinated strikes with astonishing precision. Their tactics included sudden landings, surprise attacks at dawn, and retreating to their ships before the local militia could respond. The psychological impact of their unpredictability was profound. Entire communities were paralyzed by dread, unsure where the next strike might come from. As the audience absorbs these details, tension escalates naturally. The threat is immediate, ruthless, and seemingly unstoppable. Historical depth comes from understanding the Norse worldview. Raiders were motivated not only by wealth but by honor, fame, and social status. Each successful raid elevated a chieftain's standing among peers, making violence both economically and culturally incentivized. For the Anglo-Saxons, this foreign code of ambition was incomprehensible, heightening the sense of existential threat. By depicting the Vikings as both terrifying warriors and culturally driven actors, the narrative balances fear with fascination, giving viewers both an emotional and intellectual connection to events. By the end of this section, the stakes are clear: the Vikings have arrived, and England is unprepared for the storm they bring. Coastal towns smolder, monasteries are desecrated, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms must confront the reality that their world has changed overnight. The audience is left with a mixture of dread and curiosity. How will these kingdoms respond? Who will survive? The stage is now set for the next phase of the story: strategic maneuvering, rising tension, and the early political responses that will shape the centuries to come. As the first waves of Viking raids spread along the coasts and rivers of England, the Anglo-Saxon kings faced a terrifying reality. Their kingdoms were under siege, and the old methods of defense were proving woefully inadequate. King Ethelred of Northumbria, along with rulers of Wessex, Mercia, and East Anglia, had to confront not just foreign invaders but the growing panic among their own people. Decisions made in this tense period would define the fate of their realms and test their leadership under extraordinary pressure. The initial response was often reactive, marked by hurried mobilization of local militias and attempts to fortify vulnerable towns. But these efforts were hampered by political fragmentation. Kings sometimes hesitated to call upon neighboring territories for support, wary of weakening their own authority or inviting betrayal. Emotional tension was high, villagers feared for their lives, nobles worried about their lands and legacies, and kings felt the crushing weight of responsibility. The stakes were not abstract. Every decision, or indecision, carried the possibility of devastation or survival. Strategically, the Anglo-Saxons struggled to match the Vikings' speed and flexibility. While the raiders relied on fast, small forces that could appear in one village and vanish into rivers or across the coast, the Anglo-Saxon armies were larger but slower, burdened by heavy shields, armor, and rigid formations. Battles were often improvised, with hastily gathered levies facing disciplined and experienced raiders. Tension rises as we witness commanders weighing impossible choices: confront the enemy directly and risk annihilation, or retreat and preserve forces at the cost of territory and prestige. This tactical disparity heightens the drama and keeps viewers engaged. Political maneuvering became just as crucial as military action. Alliances were forged, broken, and renegotiated in rapid succession. Some kings attempted to buy off the Vikings with tribute, silver, goods, or hostages, in the hope of delaying further destruction. Others sought counsel from advisors steeped in centuries of local lore, hoping that knowledge of rivers, terrain, and fortifications could counter the raiders' advantage. The audience gains insight into the complex calculus of medieval kingship, Survival was as much about negotiation and cunning as about sword and shield. Amid these strategic calculations, personal stakes emerge. Families were scattered, loyalties tested, and reputations made or broken. A single defeat could diminish a king's credibility, spark rebellions, or invite further raids. Conversely, a successful defense could elevate a ruler to legendary status, inspiring loyalty and uniting fragmented regions. This tension between ambition and vulnerability creates a compelling, character-driven narrative layered on top of historical events. By the end of this section, the audience understands the full scale of the challenge facing England. The Vikings are no longer isolated raiders, they are an existential threat, testing both the military might and political acumen of Anglo-Saxon rulers. The emotional stakes are clear, the kingdom's survival hangs in the balance, and the coming confrontations will determine the course of history. This sets up the next section, where the narrative moves from preparation and tension to the dramatic climax of the raid that will shake England to its core. By the mid-9th century, the Viking threat had escalated from sporadic coastal raids to a coordinated campaign that would leave an indelible mark on England. The longships appeared again, this time in formidable numbers, their prows glinting in the sunlight as they cut through the waves toward vulnerable settlements. The raid that would become infamous for its ferocity targeted one of the richest and most symbolic centers of Anglo-Saxon culture. Towns, monasteries, and fortresses along the eastern coast braced for impact, yet nothing could fully prepare them for the chaos that followed. The landing itself was a masterclass in Viking strategy. Using intelligence gathered from prior raids and local informants, the raiders struck at dawn, when vigilance was at its lowest. They moved with coordinated precision. One party seized the riverbanks to block escape, another rushed inland to plunder treasures, and a third laid ambushes for any defenders attempting to counterattack. The Anglo-Saxon levies, hastily assembled and outnumbered, met them with courage but little cohesion. The contrast between disciplined, mobile raiders and the slower, less flexible defenders created immediate suspense and palpable tension. As the Vikings advanced, monasteries that had once symbolized spiritual sanctuary were transformed into sites of horror. Precious manuscripts were torn from their bindings, gold and silver taken, and those who resisted were slaughtered. Chroniclers later described rivers running red, the wails of monks and townspeople echoing across the fields. The audience feels the emotional weight of these moments, the destruction of centuries of knowledge, the collapse of communities, and the human cost of ambition unrestrained by mercy. Cinematic storytelling comes alive here, showing both the Vikings' ruthless efficiency and the desperate courage of the Anglo-Saxons. The battle was not one-sided. Local lords attempted counterattacks, using archers, fortified positions, and natural barriers to slow the invaders. There were moments of near victory when defenders rallied, driving back portions of the raiding party. But for every success, the Vikings adapted, retreating only to regroup and strike anew. This ebb and flow of tension mirrors the uncertainty of medieval warfare and keeps the audience on edge. Each turn of the tide carries the possibility of triumph or catastrophe, and the human drama is intensified by the stakes. A single misstep could mean annihilation. Tactically, the Vikings employed innovations that would leave lasting lessons for England. They utilized rivers as highways, bypassing land-based fortifications, and coordinated attacks that mixed speed with intelligence. The Anglo-Saxons, by contrast, learned the limitations of their heavy infantry and static defenses. The clash of these two military philosophies is as much a story of adaptation and learning as it is of violence, and it underscores the historical significance of the raid. This was not merely destruction, but a turning point that forced England to rethink strategy, governance, and community defense. By the end of the raid, the toll was staggering. Towns lay in smoldering ruins, treasures were gone, and the survivors were traumatized. Yet even in the aftermath, the story is not one of complete despair. The courage of local leaders, the heroism of defenders, and the resilience of the surviving communities provide contrast and hope, ensuring that the audience experiences both horror and human endurance. This sets the stage for the next section, exploring the fallout, political repercussions, and societal transformations triggered by the raid. The smoke from burning towns and monasteries had barely cleared when the full weight of the Viking raid's consequences began to sink in. Entire communities lay shattered, their homes and livelihoods destroyed. Survivors wandered through smoldering ruins, clutching what little remained of their possessions, while the wealthy and powerful grappled with the reality that their treasures and influence had been stolen or destroyed in a single, devastating strike. For the Anglo-Saxons, the raid was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological shock, a stark awakening to the vulnerability of their kingdoms. Political repercussions rippled through every corner of England. Kings faced the impossible task of maintaining authority while rebuilding defenses and restoring public confidence. Some rulers, weakened by the losses, saw their power erode, leading to internal strife and challenges to succession. Others began to recognize that old methods, relying on regional militias and static fortifications, were insufficient against such mobile and ruthless invaders. Councils of war convened hastily, with nobles debating whether to negotiate with the Vikings through tribute or to mount organized counterattacks. The tension between fear, pragmatism, and ambition defined this chaotic period, offering viewers both historical depth and compelling narrative drama. The societal impact was equally profound. Towns that had once been centers of trade and culture were left depopulated and economically crippled. Monasteries, which had been repositories of learning and faith, faced a crisis of survival. Scholars and monks were forced to flee, manuscripts were lost, and centuries of knowledge hung by a thread. Families were separated, with some seeking refuge in more secure inland areas while others struggled to defend what remained of their homes. Emotionally, the human cost of the raid was immense. Grief, fear, and trauma permeated everyday life, creating a palpable sense of despair alongside the awe inspired by the Vikings' unstoppable force. Yet even amid destruction, resilience emerged. Communities began rebuilding, fortified towns were strengthened, and new strategies for defense were conceived. The raids forced Anglo-Saxon leaders to adapt quickly, reshaping military tactics, strengthening regional alliances, and reconsidering the distribution of power across kingdoms. The narrative contrasts despair with hope, showing that catastrophe, while devastating, can also catalyze innovation and unity. These shifts would lay the groundwork for future resistance, ultimately leading to a stronger, more centralized England in the decades to come. By the end of this section, the audience sees the full magnitude of the raid. It was not just a momentary horror but a transformative event that reshaped political, social, and military structures. The stage is now set for the concluding section, where the long-term legacy of the Vikings and their enduring influence on English history are explored. The emotional beats, loss, fear, adaptation, and resilience, prepare viewers for a reflective, satisfying conclusion that ties the entire narrative together while leaving a lasting impression of both human vulnerability and ingenuity. The Viking raid that had once brought fear, fire, and destruction ultimately left a legacy far beyond the immediate devastation. England, once fractured and unprepared, began to transform in response to this unprecedented threat. Kings strengthened their central authority, building fortified towns and reorganizing armies to be more flexible and responsive. What had begun as vulnerability became a catalyst for innovation, shaping military strategy, governance, and society for generations. Culturally, the Vikings left a lasting imprint. Though initially feared and reviled, they eventually settled in parts of England, particularly the Danelaw regions, introducing new legal systems, trade practices, and even elements of their language. Place names, customs, and cultural interactions testify to this blending of Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions. The audience is invited to reflect on the paradox of history. Destruction and integration often walk hand in hand, leaving legacies that endure far beyond the battlefield. The raid also reshaped the Anglo-Saxon psyche. Communities learned to prioritize vigilance, cooperation, and resilience. Monasteries and towns were rebuilt not merely to survive, but to thrive under the looming shadow of further threats. Kings who adapted their strategies emerged stronger, establishing precedents for leadership that valued foresight, intelligence gathering, and rapid response. Emotionally, this evolution tells a story of human resilience. Fear gave way to determination, despair to renewal, and chaos to order. Historically, the raid is remembered not just for its immediate consequences, but for its role in redefining England's trajectory. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of fragmented kingdoms, emphasized the importance of military and political innovation, and forged a sense of shared identity among disparate peoples. The Vikings, once purely invaders, became catalysts for transformation, challenging and shaping England in ways that would echo through subsequent centuries. As the documentary draws to a close, viewers are left with a powerful reflection. History is rarely a simple story of victory or defeat. It is a complex interplay of ambition, conflict, adaptation, and legacy. The Viking raid serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human societies in the face of external forces, and yet, it also celebrates the enduring capacity to rebuild, innovate, and endure. England's encounter with the Vikings was violent and terrifying, but it ultimately set the stage for a stronger, more resilient nation, leaving a mark that history has never forgotten.